At the very bottom of the page, we have practice the speed test activity. Let's look at the instructions for that one. Here you have a couple die. It just has you moving through the scene, changing your view of these die, and rotating them and moving them around. The goal is just to follow the instructions and do so as quickly as you can. Let's close these instructions. I would print them. I already have. If you print them, then you'll be able to look at them at the same time that you're working on the activity itself. I'm going to right-click on Speed Test Project Files, Save Link As. I'll just save it to my desktop as Speed Test. Because this is a Mac, I can just double-click on the speedtest.zip file, and it will extract the files in the same location. I'm going to keep my zip file because if I want to restart this activity, I can simply double-click on it again, and it'll create a copy of the project that I can start from scratch with. So I'm going to go inside the speed test folder, go to Assets, Scenes, and main.unity. So this is the scene I want to open, which will also open the project. There it is on the top. I'm going to go ahead and say yes, update to the new version, and yes, switch to a Mac target. With this activity, I'm actually going to go all the way through the activity to demonstrate the shortcuts. You should do this activity multiple times until you get completely comfortable with it. I have printed the instructions for myself and I'll just be reading them as I complete each step. Step 1. Zoom towards the yellow die until it is the only die in your view. The quick way to do this is to put your cursor in front of the yellow die, hold the Alt key down, and then use the mouse wheel to zoom. In this way, we can zoom towards the mouse wherever it is. The second step, pan to the right until the blue die is fully in your view. So that's the middle mouse button. Step 3, frame the yellow die so it is in the center of your view. And that doesn't mean just to pan back to the other side. When you frame it, you also want it to have focus and be selected. There's two ways to do this, but since the yellow die is not in view, the quickest way is to, in the hierarchy view, double-click the yellow die. It will not only zoom to it and focus on it, it selects it. Step 4, zoom in or out until it fills about half of the scene window. So that's just your mouse wheel. Orbit left around the yellow die so that you see the side with 4 pips. If it has focus, then you can just press Alt and click and drag, and it will spin around whatever is focused on. Step 6 says to rotate the yellow die so that the side with 1 pip is facing you. So I'm pressing E for the Orbit tool, and I know I want to move it in this direction, so I'm going to use this axis, and there's the 1 pip. Step 7, zoom forward through the yellow die until you see the blue die. That's just the mouse wheel. And right now, if I were to stop, I'm actually inside the yellow die. That's why I see these green lines. So I want to make sure and zoom far enough forward that I'm not inside the yellow die. Now I want to look backward towards the yellow die. That's step 8, and I just clicked off to deselect everything, but I'm going to use my right click to spin around. And there's my yellow die. Step 9, zoom backward until you pass through the blue die. Let's go back using the mouse wheel, and there's the blue die. I'm going to right click, get myself kind of lined up there, and I'm going to pan by clicking the middle mouse button. Step 10 is to rotate the blue die clockwise 90 degrees. So I select the blue die and press E if it's not already on the Orbit tool, and then I want to rotate it 90 degrees clockwise. Step 11 is to return to the starting view. That is to our left. So I could try to middle mouse click and right click to kind of make my way over there. Or since the blue die has the focus, I can use Alt and then click and drag and it will rotate me around that. I might need to pan over a little bit using middle mouse button. Step 12 is to duplicate the blue die. Pressing Command D will duplicate it. You see in the hierarchy that there is a duplicate there now. You don't see it in the scene view because it's in the same location as the other blue die. I'm going to press W to switch to the Move tool while that blue die is selected and move it to the center, which is step 13. Step 14 is to roughly double the size of the newly created die. We do that with the scale tool by pressing R. And here I'm going to grab the center, not the outsides, and make it larger in every direction. Step 15 says to frame the yellow die. Instead of double clicking on it in the hierarchy this time, since it's in our view, I can just click on it and then press F. Step 16, duplicate the yellow die, and we do that again by pressing Command D. And step 17 is to move the new yellow die to the left of the original die. So pressing W and then dragging it over. Step 18, rotate the new yellow die clockwise 90 degrees. It's already selected. I'm going to press E to get the orbit tool, and I need to click and drag on the correct axes to change that 90-degree rotation. Step 19, move the new yellow die to the right so that it is flush against the original yellow die. Pressing W will let me move it back and forth, but it might be hard to get flush. To be more precise, I can press V, which lets me choose a vertex of this die. I'm holding the V down. I'm going to grab this vertex on the corner, and then I can drag it, still holding the V down, to any other vertex on another object. And I'm going to grab this front vertex here and let go. So there might be a little too much overlap there. You can always click back on it and pull it back a little bit. That's because the rotations are not exactly the same and the vertex points are not at a 90-degree sharp angle. They're kind of curved on the corners. Step 20 is to select both yellow die. You can do this in several ways, but one way is to click in the area here and drag down. And now I've got them both selected. That is sometimes difficult if there's a lot of things around and you don't want to accidentally select other things. So another way to do this, I'm going to click off to deselect, is to come to the hierarchy, and you can click on one of them and then hold Command down to click on another. Step 21 is to rotate the yellow dice together as a group so their positions are swapped. Press E first to go to the rotate tool. So here they are grouped together well, and if I start rotating, they're going to rotate perfectly. I'm going to press Command Z to undo that. But if you had this up here unchecked, so it wasn't on center, but instead it was on pivot, now when I try to rotate, they both rotate, but they don't rotate together. So I'm going to press Command Z. We do want them to rotate together, so I'm going to go back to center there. And now you can rotate these both together until they're reversed positions. Step 22 is to change view so that you are looking down at all the die. So I think I'm going to click on the blue die, press F to focus on it, and then hold Alt down and click and drag to change my view. Now we are ready to delete the larger blue die. That's step 23. I can do that by finding it in the hierarchy, right-clicking, and saying delete. Step 24 is delete the yellow die with 6 pips showing. I'll show another way of deleting here. If I select the die, I can press Command Delete. So Command D is duplicate, Command Delete is delete. The last and final step is to move the blue die so it snaps flush against the yellow die. Again, we just select it, use W to go to the Move tool, hold the V down so that you're using the vertex movement, and click and drag to whatever spot you want to hook it to. And there we go. A little bit too much overlap there, so I'm going to pull it out a little bit. And that is the entire speed test. So you should be able to do it much more quickly than I did because you won't have to be explaining every step along the way. Good luck!